Before I tell you this story, I need to do what every YouTuber does, even though it still feels strange each time I say it. If you're listening, make sure you like the video, subscribe if you want more real stories from the wild places most people never see, and drop a comment telling me what you think. Trust me, after you hear what happened to me that winter, you'll have something to say. This isn't a story I ever planned to share, but keeping it locked inside has been eating at me for years. My name is Daniel, and I worked as a seasonal ranger in Glacier Bay National Park, up in Alaska. Most people visit the area during summer, when the water shines a bright blue and cruise ships glide between the tall cliffs. But winter is a whole different world. When the last tourists leave and the days shrink down to a few hours of gray light, the park empties out. Only a tiny skeleton crew stays behind to monitor storms, wildlife, and the old buildings that stand stubborn against the cold. That year, I thought I understood what I was signing up for. I thought the silence and the slow pace would be good for me. I thought I knew what quiet was before I arrived. I grew up in a small town and spent most of my life hiking alone. But the silence in Glacier Bay during winter isn't normal silence. It's a deep, thick stillness that settles over everything like a heavy blanket. The snow swallows sound. The frozen inlets look like long white scars stretching into the distance. And then there's the darkness. The nights feel endless, like time slows down or forgets to move. The cold digs into you in a way I can't fully explain. It feels like something is pressing against your ribs, waiting for you to slip so it can claim a piece of you. Still, I told myself I wanted this. I told myself the cold, the dark, and the emptiness would help me clear my head. But the truth was, I was running. I had just walked out of a messy breakup, one that hit me harder than I ever expected. I needed space to breathe, space to forget, space to stop checking my phone every 5 minutes. When I saw the Winter Ranger posting open up, it felt like a door I was meant to walk through. The cabin assigned to me was older than most of the others. A small square building from the 1950s, made of thick logs, with metal roof that groaned whenever the wind pushed against it. The place smelled like old with smoke and damp wool. The bunk creaked when I sat on it, and the floorboards felt uneven under my boots. Still, it was warm enough, and it was mine for the season. I told myself I could handle a few months in a place like that. On my first night, I tried to unpack as slowly as possible. Anything to avoid letting the silence settle too long. I set up my radio, my notebooks, my gear, even my coffee mug, like I was trying to rebuild a small piece of my normal life inside that lonely cabin. The wind outside made a low, steady hum. Snow tapped gently against the window. Nothing seemed out of place. It must have been close to midnight when I finally turned off the lantern and lay down. I wasn't used to complete darkness, so the shadows in the room felt strange. I pulled the blanket up to my chest and tried to relax, breathing slowly. But only a few minutes passed before I heard something that made me sit straight up. Knocking. 3 slow, solid knocks against the outside wall of the cabin. I stared into the dark, waiting for another sound. At first, I thought I might have imagined it. But then it came again. 3 knocks, same rhythm, same spot, like someone was standing right outside. I told myself it had to be the ice. Sometimes the walls shift in the cold, and animals can wander close, even in winter. But something about the sound felt too intentional, too steady, too human. I slipped out of bed and grabbed my flashlight. My breath came out in sharp clouds as I stepped toward the door. I opened it just enough to shine the beam across the snow. Nothing, no tracks, no movement, just the empty stretch of trees and the whisper of falling snow. I stood there for a long minute, trying to convince myself I wasn't already losing it. The breakup stress, the travel, the sudden drop into isolation, maybe it was all piling up faster than I realized. I shut the door, locked it, and climbed back into bed. The wind picked up again, rattling something on the roof. I focused on the familiar sounds, the ones that made sense. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had touched the walls that night, something that knew I was there. I pulled the blanket tighter around my shoulders and stared at the ceiling until the darkness felt heavy enough to push me into sleep. I told myself it was nothing, just ice or cold or nerves. I told myself morning would make everything normal again. I didn't know then that the knocking was only the beginning. I didn't know that something in Glacier Bay had already noticed me, even before I finished unpacking. And I had no idea how far I would go in the weeks ahead to make sure I didn't forget it was there, waiting. I wish I could say I slept peacefully after that. But the truth is I lay awake for hours, listening for any sign that the knocking might return. Every small sound felt sharper in the dark. Every whisper of wind made my skin crawl. And somewhere deep down, I sensed that Glacier Bay was not a place that welcomed the unprepared visitor. Morning came slowly, like the sun was unsure if it wanted to rise at all. I barely slept after the knocking, but I forced myself to get up, boil water for instant coffee, and start the routine every ranger follows during winter. Routine felt safe. Routine felt normal. And after the first night, I needed normal more than anything. Patrols came first. I walked the short loop trail behind the cabin, checking for fallen branches or signs of animals moving too close. Everything looked quiet, though the silence felt heavier than it had the day before. After that, I checked the trail markers leading toward the shoreline. The snow came up to my knees in some places, and each step felt like I was pushing through a world trying to swallow me. Glacier Bay in winter doesn't care if you're ready or not. It tests you either way. Back at the station, I logged my notes, checked it on the radio, and scanned the weather reports. A storm was expected in a few days, nothing too severe, but winter storms here always carried surprises. After lunch, I read through some old ranger logs. I told myself it was just part of learning the job, but the truth is I wanted to know what I had heard last night. I wanted to find some simple explanation in the past. Instead, I found entries that made me uncomfortable. Glacier Bay has layers of history that most visitors never hear about. Before the park existed, native settlements lined the shores. Entire families lived near the water, moving with the seasons. Then came the earthquakes, the advancing ice, the storms that changed the land over and over. Some villages were abandoned so quickly that people left tools in the ground, like they meant to return but never did. Hikers have gone missing here too. Some were found months later in places they never should have reached. Others were never found at all. Every ranger learns those stories, but reading them alone in a silent building made them feel real in a way I wasn't prepared for. One old report mentioned hearing voices in the ice during a night patrol. Another described a woman singing from the far side of the inlet when no one else was on duty. A third ranger wrote about seeing people walking on frozen water after midnight, only for the figures to vanish when he called out. The superintendent had written short notes on the side of each page. Fatigue? Audio distortion? Reflection? It was clear no one wanted to believe these things, but the rangers kept writing them anyway. During my next patrol, I remembered those logs. The snow creaked under my boots, each step echoing farther than it should have. I kept telling myself the stories were just stories, things bored rangers wrote to entertain themselves through long winters. Still, the land felt different now, like it was listening to me as much as I was watching it. That evening, the wind picked up. I made a simple dinner, filled out my weather notes, and double-checked the locks on every door. I told myself I was being cautious, not afraid, but fear had already begun to settle under my skin. Small, strange things started happening over the next few days. They weren't dramatic, just small enough to make me question myself. Once, I walked into the storage shed and found the door wide open even though I remembered closing it tightly. Another time, the back door of my cabin swung inward while I was making coffee, like someone had gently pushed it. I told myself it was the wind, even though there had been no gust strong enough to do it. Maybe I had simply forgotten to latch it. Maybe the cold made the wood shift. Maybe, but then the footprints started appearing. One morning, when the sky was a pale gray and the air felt sharp enough to cut, I stepped outside and saw a line of boot prints in the snow. They weren't mine. The tread was different, and the steps were spaced wider apart. They led from the tree line straight toward my porch. Then they turned around and went back the way they came. No wandering, no hesitation. Just a straight path to the cabin, then away again, like whoever made them only wanted to stand close for a while. I followed them until they reached the trees, but they stopped abruptly, as if the person had vanished into the air. Snow lay undisturbed beyond that point. Even animals leave trails, but this ended like someone stepped off the world itself. Later that same afternoon, I returned from patrol to find something on my porch, a single wet glove. It was dark green and much larger than anything I owned. The inside was still damp, like someone had worn it only minutes before I arrived. I called out, asking if anyone was out there. My voice bounced off the trees and died in the snow. No answer came back. I placed the glove on the railing and tried to shake it off as some visitor who passed through earlier, but no one had checked in on the radio. No one was scheduled to be near my area. There were only 3 of us working winter duty that year, and none of them had boots that matched those prints. That night, the strangest thing happened. Long after I turned off the lantern, after the cabin settled into its usual creaks and groans, I heard slow footsteps circling the walls outside. Crunch, pause. Crunch, pause. The sound moved around the whole cabin, steady and calm, as if the person knew I was awake and listening. I didn't open the door. I couldn't. I lay frozen in my bunk until the steps faded into nothing. And even then, I knew the real winter had only just begun. The footsteps I heard circling the cabin at night before stayed in my mind long after they faded. Even when I finally drifted into sleep, I kept waking up to small sounds, creaks, distant snaps, the softest of wind sliding across the walls. When morning finally came, I wasn't sure if I had slept at all. My head felt heavy, and the air in the cabin was colder than usual, like the heat had slipped out during the night. I sat up, listened, and held my breath. Nothing. No footsteps, no tapping, no knocking. Just the slow breathing of the old place. Even so, I felt something pulling me toward the door, as if the night had left something waiting for me. I stepped outside with my coat, half-zipped and my boots barely laced. The cold bit straight through the fabric, making my eyes water. But that wasn't what made me stop on the porch. It was the snow. More specifically, the line of footprints stretching away from the cabin and leading into the trees. They were the same size and tread as the ones I had seen earlier that week. Wide steps, deeper than mine, spaced evenly like someone tall had walked toward my cabin in the dark. But what struck me hardest was the sharpness of the prints. A thin layer of snow had fallen overnight, and the wind had been non-stop. Any normal footprint would have softened, blurred, or disappeared under the drifts. These hadn't changed at all. The edges were crisp, clean, almost perfect. No snow filled the centers. It was like the ground had frozen around them in the exact moment they were made. I told myself not to panic, not to get ahead of myself, but every instinct screamed that something about these prints was wrong. I crouched down and ran a glove across one. The snow around the edge felt normal, cold, soft, but the print itself felt harder, as if the bottom had iced over in a thin layer. I pulled my hand away, suddenly unsure if I should touch anything else. The trail stretched straight to the tree line, where the dark pines stood close together like a wall. I followed slowly, each step feeling heavier than the last. My breath came out in bursts of white air, and each one sounded loud in the stillness. As I got closer to the trees, the feeling of being watched pressed down harder on my shoulders, like a hand resting there. The prints continued deeper into the woods, neat and sharp, ignoring the dips in the ground and the natural unevenness of the forest floor. It was as if whoever made them wasn't bothered by roots, branches, or the thick layer of snow that blanketed everything. I tried to focus on the practical explanations. Maybe another ranger had come by. Maybe Collins wanted to check on me after the strange reports in the logs. Maybe someone from Gustavus had wandered too far, but none of those ideas made sense. No one would travel alone at night in winter, not without calling it in. I took a few more steps, just enough to see a bend in the trail where the footprints turned left. As I stared at that spot, a sound drifted through the air. At first, I thought it was the wind, but then it grew clearer. Soft, slow humming. It came from deeper in the woods. A single voice, humming a tune I didn't recognize. The melody was gentle, almost tired, like someone singing to themselves while they worked. It didn't sound threatening, but it didn't sound natural either. Not here. Not in the frozen quiet of Glacier Bay. I froze in place, my breath catching in my throat. The humming continued for several seconds, drifting between the trees. Then it faded slowly, so slowly that I wasn't sure the moment it stopped. The silence that followed was thick, as if the woods were waiting for me to do something. I turned around. I knew I couldn't keep going. Everything inside me screamed that whatever was making that sound wasn't something I should meet alone. My duty as a ranger didn't include chasing after strange singing in the forest. Not when the prince didn't melt. Not when the night before felt like someone had circled the cabin just to see if I'd open the door. Back at the station, I grabbed the radio and called in my findings. My voice cracked more than once, and I hated how nervous I sounded. A few seconds passed before Collins answered. His tone was casual at first, but when I told him about the footprints and the humming, he went quiet. Too quiet. "Don't worry about it," he finally said, but the tightness in his voice betrayed him. "You're new to winter duty. The cold messes with sound. Snow shifts around. Tracks can freeze weird. Happens all the time." I waited for him to laugh, to tell me he was just messing with me, but he didn't. He mumbled something about checking in later and cut the transmission short. I stared at the radio for a long time after that, wondering why he sounded more afraid than I was. The rest of the day passed slowly. I tried to focus on normal tasks, with inventory, weather logs, map updates, but my mind kept drifting back to the prints. How they ignored the snow. How they led straight into the trees. How the humming seemed to know I was following. Night fell early, around 4 in the afternoon. I made dinner, checked the doors twice, then 3 times. I tried to read, tried to distract myself, but the cabin felt like a box trapping every thought in my head. When I finally turned off the lantern and lay down, the darkness swallowed everything. A few minutes later, my radio clicked on with a soft crackle. No voice, no message, just faint whispers, like someone breathing words they didn't want me to hear. And the channel was completely silent. The whispers from the night before still cling to my mind when dawn barely lifted the darkness off the bay. I barely slept, kept awake by the uneasy feeling that something had leaned close to my cabin wall and listened to me breathe. By morning, the snowfall has calmed, leaving behind a silent white blanket broken only by the ghostly footprints I found earlier, still sharp, still unmelted. I try not to look at them as I prepare for my routine storm check, but my eyes drift there anyway, drawn the way you're drawn to a wound. The forest is still, almost too still, as I make my way across the path toward the outpost. The radio tower looms overhead, its metal frame coated in a thin layer of frost. The air smells metallic like snow and old static. As I climb the steps into the radio shack, I try to shake the lingering tension, telling myself today will be normal. Just wind, just weather, just routine. But the moment I flick the radio system on, a burst of static hisses through the room. It's louder than usual, sharp enough to make me wince. I set down my thermos and adjust the dial, try to clear it. That's when the static shifts just a fraction, and a voice seeps through. A whisper, too close, too deliberate. "You're not alone in the bay." The words are so clear they seem spoken directly beside me, not through a machine. I freeze, my hand hovering above the console. My first instinct is that it's another ranger, someone running a test, someone nearby. "Station 2 to all channels." I say, my voice wavering. "Identify yourself." Nothing, only the sound of wind against the tower and the soft grind of static sliding in and out like breathing. Repeat. I try again. Who's transmitting? Still nothing. The silence that follows is worse than the whisper. Silence means uncertainty. Silence means I might have imagined it. Except I didn't. The voice had clarity, purpose. Someone meant for me to hear it. A cold knot forms in my stomach as I scan through the frequencies. Every channel is empty. It shouldn't be possible for a transmission that clear to vanish without trace. I stand and search the room instead, running my hand along the table, checking the cables, even looking behind the equipment rack. Nothing out of place. Nothing that explains a voice like that. That's when I notice the old logbook shoved near the base of the console, half buried under a box of unused wiring. The cover is cracked leather. The edges curl from years of moisture. Curiosity outweighs caution, and I kneel to pull it free. Inside, the pages are yellowed and stained, the handwriting shifting in style as the years pass. At first, it contains mundane notes about weather readings, maintenance reports, supply deliveries. Then, deeper into the book, the entries change. The tone shifts. The handwriting becomes quicker, uneven. Several entries mention a humming sound near the shoreline at night, described as soft but persistent, like a woman singing from somewhere just out of sight. My blood cools as I flip the pages faster. One ranger describes waking to hear whispering beneath his cabin floor. Another writes of seeing movement on the water, even when the bay was fully frozen. And then I find a short entry, dated nearly 15 years ago. The ink smeared like the writer's hand shook as he wrote it. If you hear her humming, do not follow. No explanation. No further details. Just a warning delivered with a kind of desperate finality that makes my skin crawl. I set the logbook down, suddenly aware of the dead, quiet pressing in around the radio room. The air feels heavier, as if the walls have shifted closer. I want to leave. I want to pretend I never read any of this. But the voice from moments earlier still echoes inside my head. You're not alone in the bay. The snow crunches outside. One sharp step, not the natural settling of ice. I tense and peer out the frosted window. Nothing moves. Nothing appears. Yet the print of that single step remains in my mind. By the time I return to my cabin that evening, the sky is darkening again, heavy clouds rolling in. The heater runs steadily, but something in the air feels colder, almost damp, as though the warmth can't settle properly. I rub my hands together and try to focus on writing up the storm report. Then the humming begins. Not faint like before. Not distant. Close. It threads through the gaps in the cabin walls, a soft, melodic sound that seems almost human, but not quite right. The notes dip in strange ways, forming patterns that feel intentional. For a moment, I'm paralyzed, the pencil slipping from my fingers and landing on the floor. I think of the logbook. If you hear her humming, do not follow. I swallow hard and move to the radio, hoping irrationally that contacting Collins will steady me. But before I reach the desk, something knocks on the cabin wall. Once, twice, then again, slow, rhythmic. I freeze when I realize the pattern is familiar. It's the exact rhythm of my heartbeat. Thump, thump, thump. Perfectly matched. My pulse spikes, but the knocking adjusts instantly, keeping pace. My breath catches, and the room seems to shrink around me. Something is out there. Something that knows I'm inside. The humming grows clearer, almost as if it's smiling through the sound. And somewhere deep in the back of my mind, I sense that this is only the beginning, that whatever is following me is getting closer, learning more, waiting for the right moment to step into view. And tonight, she is not going to stop at the walls. Gustavus looked even smaller in winter than I remembered. Most of the shops were closed, and the pier grown under a fresh layer of snow. I came for basic supplies, fuel canisters, canned food, and batteries, but part of me just wanted to see another human face. After the last few nights in the cabin, the idea of even a dusty old store felt comforting. The sky hung low and gray, and the air smelled like salt and frozen pine. Inside the general store, the heater buzzed weakly, fighting the cold that slipped in every time someone opened the door. Only two people were inside. The owner behind the counter and an elderly Tlingit woman wandering the aisles with a basket. She moved slowly, as if each step carried memory. When I grabbed my supplies and set them on the counter, she turned to look at me. Her eyes were sharp, like she recognized something before I even spoke. "You're one of the winter rangers," she said. Her voice was soft but carried weight. I nodded. Glacier Bay Station. The owner didn't react, but the old woman did. Her shoulders stiffened, and she took a small step closer. "We're in the bay?" "East cabin near the shoreline," I said without thinking. It was the same kind of small talk I use with tourists in the summer. But this wasn't summer, and she wasn't a tourist. Her face changed. Not fear exactly, more like concern mixed with something older. "Have you heard her yet?" she asked. "Who?" I asked, though I already felt the answer creeping in. "The winter singer," she whispered. My stomach tightened. I reminded myself this was just a legend, a story told during dark months to explain strange sounds. Still, the way she said it made the back of my neck prickle. I tried to smile, tried to keep my tone light. Some weird noises, sure. Cabin walls, ice shifting, radios messing up. She shook her head before I even finished. Not ice, not wood. She hums when the nights are longest. I didn't know how to respond. The owner stayed silent, eyes down. The room felt colder. I finally asked, "Who is she supposed to be?" The woman set her basket on the counter and pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders. Long ago, before the park, before the big boats, there was a small settlement along that shore. Families lived through many winters there. But one storm came early. Fierce winds, heavy snow. They say a woman went out searching for her husband and children who hadn't returned from the water. The woman paused, as if seeing it. She never came back. Lost the storm? I said. Some said she froze. Some said she drowned. But her body was never found. She lifted her eyes to mine. People later claimed they saw her walking the shoreline at night. Her steps didn't break the snow. Her voice wasn't quite human. They said she was looking still. Her words settled into my chest like stones. I tried to tell myself it was just superstition, just a town story shaped by isolation. But the tracks I saw, the humming in the woods, the whispers on the radio, each detail suddenly felt too close to her legend. She doesn't hurt people, the elder continued, unless they follow her, unless they answer. Her spirit, they say, tries to become the living. Footsteps, knocking, even voices on the wind. She learns from whoever listens. I swallowed hard. Why are you telling me this? Because you're alone there, and she watches the lonely first. Her voice softened. She looks for someone who hears her, someone who might help her finish what she couldn't. I forced a breath. I appreciate the warning, I said, trying to keep steady. But I'm sure there's a normal explanation. The wind in winter sounds like singing sometimes. She gave a slow, sad shake of her head. You already know it is not the wind. I didn't argue. Something in her expression made it pointless. The owner finally spoke, telling me the total, and I paid quickly just to break the tension. But even as I packed my supplies into my backpack, I felt the woman's eyes on me. As I headed for the door, she spoke one last time. When she knocks, she said, do not open, and do not let her hear fear in your breath. Outside, the air hit me like a slap. I stood on the snowy boardwalk, breathing in sharp gulps, trying to shake off the chill she left in me. The boat ride back to the park was quiet. The sky turned purple with the early dusk, and the water rippled under thin sheets of drifting ice. I kept replaying her words, trying to tell myself it was just winter talk, old stories clinging to people who had lived through too many storms. But I couldn't ignore the way Ranger Collins had paused on the radio. The footprints that didn't melt, the glove that wasn't mine, the heartbeat pattern knocking on my cabin wall. When I reached the dock at Glacier Bay, the air felt heavier, like the place itself knew where I had been. The trail back to the cabin was empty, but I felt watched the whole walk. Snow clung to the trees like powdered bones. My boots crunched in the silent stillness, and every sound felt too sharp. I unlocked the cabin door and stepped inside. The heater hummed softly. My breath hung in the air longer than it should have, like the room itself didn't want to warm. I set down the supplies, checked the windows, checked the latch on the back door. Things I suddenly felt the need to double-check. Night came fast. I tried to read, tried to write in a logbook, tried anything to shut my mind off. But the elder's voice kept echoing. She looks for someone who listens. Hours later, when I finally lay down, I pulled the blankets tight and forced my eyes closed. That's when I heard it. A slow, steady breath right outside my window. Not wind, not an animal. Human, close, watching, and listening. The breath outside my cabin window stayed with me long after it stopped. I'd barely slept, and when I did drift off, it was a kind of sleep where every sound pulled me back to the surface. By morning, I felt hollow. My first thought was that I needed to report what happened. But before I reached for the radio, I noticed a blinking light on my laptop. A new email. Strange. Nobody emailed me out here. The connection was weak, and I usually kept the network off. The sender's name froze me. My father. He almost never wrote. We were close in a distant way, if that made sense. Respectful, polite, but not emotional. We didn't call unless something big happened. Birthdays, holidays, emergencies. So seeing his name felt wrong before I even opened the message. I clicked it, expecting something simple or practical. Maybe a check-in. Maybe a question about the holidays. But the email wasn't simple. It wasn't anything I expected. He wrote, "I need to tell you something about our family. Something I should have said years ago. Your grandmother, my mother, went missing in Glacier Bay during the winter of 1963. I read it twice, then a third time. My stomach tightened. He continued. She was on a research trip. The last place she was seen was near the old settlement ruins along the eastern shoreline. No body was found, just her glove and her pack. I didn't tell you because our family decided it was better to leave it buried. But when I heard you took a winter post there, I couldn't stay quiet anymore. I leaned back in my chair, heart pounding. My throat felt dry. My father wasn't dramatic. He didn't tell stories. If he said something happened, it happened. And this was something he had kept locked away my entire life. I whispered to myself, why didn't he tell me? But the bigger question hit me harder. Why did I end up working here without knowing any of this? A cold wave moved through me. Glacier Bay had always drawn me for reasons I never understood. When the winter position opened, I applied without thinking. It felt right. It felt necessary, like a place I needed to be. But now, with this email in front of me, that feeling twisted into something darker. My grandmother had walked these same shores, and she vanished without explanation. I stared at the screen, waiting for more text that wasn't coming. No comforting words. No advice. Just the truth, raw and late. I stood up and paced the room. The cabin creaked softly with the shifting cold. Outside, the wind brushed snow against the door. I had always believed the park watched me, listened to me, but now it felt different, personal, like something here already knew who I was. Maybe it had known the moment I arrived. My thoughts tangled with the elder's warning from Gustavus. She looks for someone who listens. Had my grandmother listened? Had she followed? Or had something followed her? My hand shook as I shut the laptop. I needed air. I stepped outside, pulling on my coat and boots. The sky was a dull silver, and the trees stood black against the frozen landscape. My breath floated out in thick clouds. The shoreline stretched quiet and empty, but I couldn't stop imagining her, my grandmother, walking here decades ago, long before I was born. I tried to picture her face, but I'd only seen a couple faded photos. Still, something in my chest tightened, like a piece of me remembered her even if my mind didn't. I didn't stay outside long. The cold felt heavier than usual, pressing against me instead of just stinging. When I returned to the cabin, I locked the door, checked the windows again, then sat on the edge of bed, trying to calm down. By late afternoon, exhaustion pulled at me. I laid down just for a minute, but sleep crept over me faster than I expected. And that's when the dream came. I stood on the frozen shoreline, the ice glowing pale blue under a moonless sky. A woman stood far out on the ice, her figure slim and still. I couldn't see her face, only her long dark hair blowing in a wind I couldn't feel. She lifted her arm and pointed at me. Then she called my name. Not just said it, called it like she had been waiting for me for a very long time. Her voice echoed across the ice, soft but sharp, familiar, almost comforting, almost like something I should remember. I tried to move toward her, but my feet wouldn't lift. The ice cracked beneath her, but she didn't fall. She only kept pointing, kept calling, until her voice stretched into a long hum that wrapped around my ears and sank into my chest. I woke up gasping. The cabin was dark now. The heater buzzed. My blanket was half off the bed. I sat there for a second, trying to steady my breathing. Then I saw the window. My heart stopped. On the inside of the frost-covered glass. On the inside, someone had drawn letters with a fingertip. The thin, melted trail stood out against the ice. 2 words. Come see. I stared at them, unable to move. The room felt too still, too cold, too aware. My breath shook out in a thin cloud. Someone had been inside while I slept. Someone had stood inches from me. Or something. The words dripped slowly as the frost shifted, and I felt a pull deep inside. Like the dream was still happening, like the woman was still out there on the ice, waiting. My grandmother had vanished here, and now something in Glacier Bay wanted me to follow. The message on the window stayed with me through the night. I kept the lights on until sunrise, sitting at the edge of my bed like if I blinked too long, something would step out of shadows. When morning finally came, the frost letters had melted away, leaving only faint streaks on the glass. But I knew what I saw. I knew someone or something had been inside. I barely had time to gather myself before the radio crackled to life. Ranger Collins' voice came through, strained by static. Storm rolling in. Whiteout expected by afternoon. Do one last shoreline check before the markers get buried. I almost said no. I almost told him about the window, the dream, the footprints, everything. But when I pressed a radio button, the words wouldn't come out. Maybe I didn't want to sound scared. Maybe I knew he wouldn't believe me. Or maybe a part of me felt like turning back now would make everything worse. So I said, "Copy," grabbed my gear and stepped outside. The storm had already begun to gather in the distance, a heavy gray wall creeping across the sky. The wind carried a sharp bite, stinging my cheeks as I made my way into the woods. The trail looked normal enough, but something felt off, like the world was holding its breath. No birds, no rustling branches, no distant cracking ice, just stillness. My boots pressed into the snow with soft crunches that sounded too loud in the silence. I moved slowly, scanning for fallen markers or debris. The storm clouds crept closer with each step, dimming the daylight. After 20 minutes, I reached a point where the trees thinned and the shoreline came into view. And that's when I saw them. Footprints. Fresh ones. They started at the edge of the trail and led down toward the water, but they weren't like the ones before. These prints were narrower, sharper, and disturbingly clear. And as I stared longer, my stomach twisted. They were barefoot, bare feet, in the middle of a freezing storm, in snow deep enough to swallow a person's ankle. The toes were long, the arches deep, the impressions too smooth to belong to any animal. I crouched closer, touching the edge of one print with my glove. The snow around it was cold but undisturbed. No melting, no frost breakdown. It was like the foot that made it didn't carry heat at all. I glanced toward the water, my breath coming out in quick, nervous clouds. The prints continued down the slope toward the ice-covered bay. A sane person would have turned around. I should have turned around. But curiosity and dread pulled me forward like invisible hands. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if the snow didn't want me following. Halfway down the slope, I froze. A sound drifted across the ice. A humming sound. Soft at first, like the whisper of wind through a bottle. Then, clearer, slow, low, sad. My chest tightened. I knew that sound. I had heard it in my dream and outside my cabin and deep in the woods days before. But hearing it in daylight, hearing it so close, felt worse, like something unseen had stepped just behind me. The humming grew louder as I reached the flat stretch of snow near the shoreline. My heartbeat pounded in my ears, mixing with the distant song. I scanned the bay, trying to find the source. Then I saw her, a figure standing far out on the frozen water. She wasn't moving. She wasn't walking. She just stood there, facing down, as if staring into the ice beneath her feet. Her hair hung long and dark, blowing slightly in the wind. She wore something pale, maybe a dress, maybe a coat. It was hard to tell from a distance, but everything about her looked wrong. Too still, too quiet, too thin against the endless white. My breath caught. Even from far away, something about her shape pulled a memory I didn't want to have. My grandmother, my dream, the humming. I took one cautious step closer. The ice creaked under the distance between us, though I wasn't standing on it yet. I swallowed and called out, "Hello? Do you need help?" The humming stopped. She didn't lift her head. She didn't answer. The world felt frozen, not just the bay, but everything around me. The air pressed in, thick and heavy, like the storm itself was watching. Then the figure turned. Not the body, just the head. Slowly, too slowly, as if the neck were stretching, twisting, learning how to move. Her face came into view, though blurred by distance. But even blurred, I knew something was wrong. The eyes were dark spaces. The mouth hung slightly open, like she was about to speak. I felt something inside me break. A cold spike of terror shot down my spine, and every instinct screamed at me to run. I took one step back, then another. The figure didn't move, but I felt her eyes tracking me, following me, pulling at me. When I turned to run, the world exploded into white wind. The storm had reached the shoreline faster than expected. Snow whipped against my face, blinding me as I sprinted up the slope. The trail vanished under blowing drifts. Branches scraped my jacket. My boots slipped on buried ice. Behind me, the humming returned, but this time it moved. It followed. The sound slid across the snow without footsteps, growing sharper and closer with each frantic step I took. I didn't dare look back. I could feel the cold at my heels, like a hand reaching through the storm. My lungs burned. My legs shook. I kept running, crashing through the trees, chasing the faint memory of a trail now buried under storm's rage. The humming shifted, rising into a long, sharp note that crawled under my skin. Then silence. Total silence. I didn't stop. I didn't breathe. I just ran until the cabin's shape appeared through the white curtain, dark and shaky in the wind. I stumbled inside, slammed the door, locked it, and backed away, gasping. The humming had stopped, but the silence felt worse. Darker. Watching. I pressed my back to the wall, shaking, knowing one awful truth. Something out there had seen me, and now it knew how to follow me. I stayed inside the cabin for almost an hour, trying to calm my shaking hands. The storm slammed against the walls, rattling the windows like something angry was trying to get in. I kept replaying the figure on the ice, the slow turn of her head, the humming that chased me through the trees. My chest felt tight, like I had left part of myself out there in the storm, and it was still calling to me. When the wind eased a little, I forced myself to head toward the main ranger station. I didn't want to go alone, but I couldn't stay in the cabin either. The silence between gusts felt charged, like the bay itself was holding a breath. By the time I reached the station, the snow was up to my knees and the sky had darkened into a heavy blanket. I pushed open the door and stepped inside, stomping the snow from my boots. The warmth hit me first, then the smell of old coffee and wet wool. Collins was standing near the radio table. He looked up the moment he heard the door. "You okay?" he asked, but his voice didn't sound casual. It sounded like he already knew the answer. I tried to stay steady. "I saw something on the ice." He didn't look surprised, not even a little. Instead, he rubbed the back of his neck and let out a long, tired breath. "Close the door," he said. "We need to talk." I shut it behind me, my heart thudding again. Collins wasn't the type to get dramatic. He'd been through winters here longer than anyone. If something shook him, it was real. He motioned me to sit at the small wooden table. I sat. He stayed standing, pacing a few steps before leaning his hands on the back of a chair. "You heard humming," he said, more as a statement than a question. "Yes," I said, "out there today, and at my cabin." And I hesitated. "On the radio." He nodded once, jaw tightening. "I've heard it too." The air felt colder instantly. "For years," he added. My mouth went dry. "Why didn't you say anything?" He gave a small, tired laugh. "Because if I told you the first day, you'd pack your bags and leave. Most rangers do. The ones who stay don't want to talk about it. Talking makes it worse." He paused. "Talking makes her hear you." I swallowed. "Who is she?" He didn't answer at first. He wiped a hand over his face, as if trying to push away something that clung to his skin. Finally he said, "The locals call her a spirit. Some call her a ghost. I don't know what she is, but she watches people. Certain people. What people? I whispered. His eyes lifted to mine, and the look on his face made my blood run cold. People with loss in their blood. A chill crawled up my back. He continued before I could speak. I didn't know why she followed some rangers and ignored others. Then I heard rumors from Gustavus. Stories that she's drawn to bloodlines connected to the old settlement. Families who lost someone out here. He paused, swallowing hard. People like you. My breath hitched. You knew? No, he said quickly. Not for sure. But when you told me your last name, something clicked. I remembered seeing it in the old disappearance reports from decades ago. His voice lowered. Your grandmother. My heart thudded so hard it hurt. Why didn't you tell me? He shook his head. I hoped it wasn't connected. I hoped you'd make it through winter without... He trailed off, then looked at the floor, without waking her. The room felt like it tilted slightly. I gripped the edge of the table. Collins finally looked at me again. And today, that store wasn't just weather. She stirs things up when she's hungry. Hungry for what? I asked. He hesitated. Company. Recognition. Someone to see her. A pause. Someone to replace what she lost. My skin prickled. I didn't understand, but I did. She thinks I'm her family. I whispered. Collins didn't answer. He didn't have to. We sat in silence for a long moment. The storm outside beat against the walls again. Finally, he said, Go back to your cabin. Lock every door. Don't answer anything you hear tonight. His voice was firm, almost commanding. It scared me enough that I didn't argue. I got up, put on my coat, and stepped back into the storm, my pulse thudding in my ears. The walk back felt longer than usual. Every shadow looked like something waiting. Every gust of wind sounded like humming if I listened too closely. When I reached the cabin, I shoved the door closed and slid the heavy bolt into place. The silence came first, then the tapping. It started soft. A gentle tap, tap, tap on the floorboards. I froze near the doorway, heart slamming in my chest. I waited, hoping it had been the heater or the shifting wood. Then it matched my breath. Every inhale, tap. Every exhale, tap. The sound followed my lungs like it knew me, like it had been listening for a long time. Slowly, terrified, I knelt down, placing my palm against the wooden floor. The tapping grew sharper, closer. I lowered my ear toward the boards. The wood felt cold, too cold. Then a whisper slid through the cracks, like wind slipping through a keyhole. It spoke my name. Not harsh, not angry. Soft, familiar, like someone calling me home. I jerked back so fast I hit the wall behind me. The whisper grew longer, stretching into a sigh. I held my breath, hoping it would stop. It didn't. The whisper turned into a low, desperate cry, one that cracked in the middle, like someone begging through ice. I clamped my hands over my ears and shouted, Stop! For a moment, everything went still. Then the voice answered, not a whisper now, but sound full of grief that didn't belong to anything human. A cry that rose from under the cabin, shaking the floor, shaking the walls, shaking the breath straight out of my chest. A cry that sounded like someone who had been waiting for me for a very, very long time. The storm arrived faster than the forecast predicted. By evening, the sky looked bruised, swollen with snow, and the clouds pressed down so low they felt almost tangled in the treetops. The wind had that hollow, whistling moan, like the sound of something dragging its breath along the mountains. After what I'd heard beneath the floorboards the night before, I should have felt prepared for anything. But as midnight fell, I realized there was no way prepared for the kind of night Glacier Bay was about to give me. The blizzard slammed into the cabin with a violence that made the walls tremble. Snow battered the windows in thick sheets, and the wind howled like a living thing. Inside, the radio flickered between static and silence. Every few minutes, the lights sputtered and dimmed, blinking weakly before buzzing back to life. I tried adjusting the dials, checking the backup batteries, anything to get a signal, anything to hear another human voice, but all I got was empty crackling. I wasn't truly alone, though. The humming had returned. It started faint, almost like distant singing carried on the wind. But as the storm grew heavier, the humming sharpened, threading its way through the cabin walls. It wasn't muffled or vague this time. It was clear, too clear, as if someone was standing inches behind me, barely whispering a melody into my ear. The same sorrowful tune I had heard on the trail. The same impossible voice that echoed under my floorboards. I froze, listening. My breath fogged the air in front of me, even though the heater buzzed on full power. A chill seeped across the room, sliding up my back like a cold hand. When I stepped toward the window, the humming shifted, growing louder, closer. Then I heard footsteps. They came from above. Slow, heavy steps creaked across the roof, each one measured and deliberate. Not like an animal, not like shifting snow. Something was walking across the cabin, dragging its weight from one end to the other. The wooden beams groaned under the pressure. I grabbed my flashlight, though my hand shook hard enough that the beam jittered wildly. The footsteps paused, then continued again, this time moving directly over me. I backed up until I pressed against the far wall, pulse hammering. The storm outside answered with its own violence. Something huge slid down the side of the cabin, sending a cascade of snow crashing past the window. I flinched instinctively, heart pounding. The hum deepened, becoming a low vibration in the walls, the floor, even inside my chest, as if the entire cabin throbbed with the sound. My vision blurred at the edges. It felt like I wasn't just hearing the humming, but absorbing it. "Stop," I whispered, though my voice barely rose over the storm. "Please, stop." The humming didn't stop. It changed. A new voice threaded into it. Not sung, spoken. Soft, female, close. So close it felt like it was forming inside my skull. "You hear me?" My breath snapped short. I spun, flashlight beams slicing across the cramped room, shaking, desperately searching for a shape, a shadow, anything. But the cabin was empty. Another voice followed, this one sharper, trembling with grief. "Don't leave me again." My skin went cold. I staggered back, bumping into the table, the log stacked beside the stove spilling across the floor. Again. Why again? Thunder cracked overhead, an explosion of sound that rattled the windows. The power flickered once, twice, then died. Sudden darkness swallowed the cabin, leaving only the flashlight's thin beam cutting through the dim. The radio let out a long, steady hiss before falling silent. The humming vanished. For a moment, the only sound was a storm. Then, crunch, right outside my front door. I jerked toward the window. The flashlight beam trembled across the frost-rimmed glass. At first I saw only swirling snow, wind-blown drifts twisting like white ghosts in the dark. But then, a figure emerged. The same one I'd seen on the frozen bay. Tall, thin, wearing something old and tattered that snapped in the wind like wet cloth. Its hair hung stiff around its face, frozen into long, jagged strands. The body faced the door, completely still, while the head leaned at a painful angle, as if listening. I felt suddenly weightless, as though the world had dropped out from under me. My throat tightened. The flashlight quivered. My breath fogged the window in shaky bursts. "Grandma?" I whispered before I could stop myself. The figure didn't move, didn't tilt its head further. But something changed in the air around me, as if the cabin itself took a breath. A faint, icy pressure built behind my eyes, like someone gently pushing from within. Then the voice returned, inside my mind, intimate and pleading. "Don't leave me again." Memories rushed in. My father's email, his quiet guilt, the truth about the grandmother who vanished here in the 1960s, the old settlement ruins, the shoreline trail, the winter storms that swallow people whole. What if she never left? What if she'd been here all along, waiting? My hand lifted without me meaning to. The flashlight beam shook. The figure at the door didn't blink, didn't sway, didn't breathe, but the snow around its feet didn't move either. The wind tore across the bay, ripping drifts on the ground, yet the snow at its base remained perfectly still, unruffled. Something unnatural held in place. The voice inside me grew louder, sharper. Come back, come back. The pressure behind my eyes tightened until tears leaked hot down my cheeks. I stumbled toward the door, not out of bravery, not out of curiosity, but because whatever called to me had wrapped invisible fingers around my lungs and pulled. When I reached the door, my hand hovered over the latch. The storm raged outside, but I barely heard it. All I heard was her voice. All I felt was her grief, deep enough to swallow entire winters. I thought of Collins, of the elder of Gustavus, of warnings I was too late to understand. She looks for someone who listens. And I had listened. I felt the last thread of rational fear snap inside me. My hand closed around the latch. The door handle was ice cold, so cold it felt alive. I hesitated. The voice softened. Please, don't leave me alone again. Something inside me shattered. I opened the door. The wind exploded inward, flinging snow and ice across the room. My flashlight flickered wildly. The storm roared around me, a chaotic swirl of white. And then everything went silent. Not the storm, not the wind. I went silent. My breath froze midair. My heartbeat thudded painfully once, then slowed, matching a distant rhythm I didn't recognize. The figure stood inches from me now, closer than the window had shown. Her face, if it was her face, was pale, smooth like polished stone, with dark hollows where eyes should have been. Frost clung to her skin in delicate patterns, almost beautiful. Her head tilted further, the angle impossible. I wanted to step back, but my feet were rooted. She leaned in, her hollow gaze fixed on me, and though her lips didn't move, the voice echoed inside my skull. You came back to me. The world blurred. The storm swallowed us both. And everything, light, sound, air, broke. The moment I stepped outside, the blizzard swallowed me. Snow hit my face like shards of glass, and the wind tore through my coat, cutting through every layer I wore. Within seconds, I could barely see my own hands in front of me. The frozen shoreline, the trees, the cabin, all vanished into an unbroken wall of white. I stumbled forward, the cold biting into my skin, but I couldn't stop. I couldn't turn back. That voice, her voice, still echoed in my mind. Somewhere in the storm, I heard it again, a cry, low, trembling, human, sorrowful, desperate, heart-wrenching. It pierced the roar of the wind. I tried to locate it, but the blizzard distorted everything. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I felt my stomach twist, my chest tighten. The sound was unbearably familiar, impossibly close, like it belonged to someone I had known all my life. And then I saw her. A shadowy figure emerged from the whiteout, barely visible at first. The shape grew clearer as I stumbled closer. Arms stretched forward, reaching toward me, long and thin. Her hair whipped in the storm, dark against the pale snow. Her body seemed to float slightly above the ice, or maybe the wind carried her in a way my eyes couldn't track. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I was frozen in both awe and terror. I forced my legs to move, sprinting across the uneven shoreline. Even though I could barely see my own feet, the ice groaned beneath me with deep, ominous cracks, warning me of the danger I was ignoring. The snow covered everything in white, but the sound of the ice beneath me reminded me that I was not entirely safe. Every step threatened to betray me. Then I stumbled. My foot slipped on a hidden patch of thin ice, sending me sprawling forward. I caught myself with my hands and looked down. For the first time, I noticed the ice was translucent here, thinner than anywhere else along the bay. The wind ripped snow off the surface, exposing the pale, bluish frozen water beneath. My breath caught when I saw what lay under it. A hand, skeletal, pale, pressed against the underside of the ice, stretched upward. Fingers spread wide, as if trying to reach something above. Trapped and desperate, my stomach flipped violently, and I recoiled, my hands flying to my mouth. The horror made my knees weak. I had never expected this. I had never wanted to see the truth. Then I realized I wasn't looking at just one. Dozens of shapes, frozen in positions of struggle or despair, were trapped beneath the ice. Arms reaching, heads turned, bodies frozen mid-step. I staggered backward, the blizzard whipping my face and stealing my breath. but my eyes couldn't leave the ice. The frozen bay had become a graveyard. The shadowed figure, the singer, hovered above the thin ice. Her hands extended toward me, and the wind carried a strange energy, pulling at my chest and stomach. I felt a weight pressing down, a wave of grief, so immense it almost knocked me off my feet. The sadness wasn't just hers. It was shared by the dozens of frozen bodies below, all of them trapped, all of them longing. For a moment, I understood. I felt the collective suffering of those lost to this bay over decades. It was overwhelming. I wanted to collapse, to curl into myself, to disappear. The figure leaned closer, the ice creaking beneath her invisible weight. Her face, or what I could see of it, was pale and still, but the eyes, dark hollows at first glance, glimmered faintly with a sorrow that burned straight into my soul. I felt like someone was begging me, crying silently, "Stay. Don't leave me. Don't leave us again." I took a step back, and the ice groaned even louder. My heart pounded in my ears. Panic took over. Every instinct told me to run. I tried to move, but the snow slowed me down, turning my flight into a desperate struggle. She moved closer, arms outstretched, almost gentle, but the sheer despair radiating from her was suffocating. Then, as I stumbled over a small drift, a strong hand grabbed my arm from behind. I yelped, spinning, and almost fell again. Collins appeared through the storm, his coat flapping in the wind, eyes wide with urgency. "Come on!" he shouted over the roar of the blizzard. "We don't have time." I tried to pull free, but the figure above me shifted slightly. Her arms reached farther, and the pressure in my chest intensified. The longing, the grief, the weight of decades of loss, almost tangible, pressed into my skin. I wanted to fall to my knees and stay there, to listen, to feel, to acknowledge everything trapped in the ice. But Colin's grip was firm. He yanked me backward, dragging me over the uneven ice, away from the frozen shoreline and the specter that hovered above it. The wind tore at us, carrying snow in stinging gusts, but I could still hear the crying. Not just hers. Layers of voices, soft whispers, desperate pleas, harmonizing into a haunting choir that echoed through the storm. The bay itself seemed alive with them, thrumming under the ice and through the wind. Collins didn't let go. He pulled me past jagged ridges of frozen snow, past cracks in the ice that gaped like mouths. Each step was a battle against the storm and my own terror. Behind us, the figure followed in silence, gliding just above the ice, arms still extended, motionless except for the faint sway of the long, dark hair. Finally, we reached a place where the trees began, where the wind was slightly blocked by the ridge. Collins pushed me to my knees behind a fallen spruce, chest heaving, eyes wide with fear and disbelief. The storm still raged, but at least here the snow wasn't driving straight into our faces. I gasped, catching my breath, listening to the layered wailing of the bay, trying to understand what I had seen. The singer's figure had stopped at the edge of the open ice. She didn't follow further. She just hovered, unmoving, watching, and then, slowly, impossibly, she sank down toward the ice, disappearing beneath it as though she had been tethered to it all along. The crying continued, fading into the wind but never fully gone. Collins crouched beside me, still holding my arm. "You saw them," he said quietly, almost reverently. "The bay it doesn't forget." He didn't explain further. He didn't need to. The frozen bodies, the skeletal hand, the hollow eyes, the grief that pressed on my chest, it all spoke for itself. I wanted to speak, to ask 100 questions at once, but words failed me. All I could do was nod, overwhelmed by the enormity of what I had witnessed. Something ancient, something bound to loss and memory, had been waiting for me, and for a fleeting, horrifying moment, I understood why my grandmother's disappearance had never been solved, why the bay had swallowed her whole, leaving only grief behind. Collins helped me stand. We retreated through the storm, one step at a time, toward the safety of the cabin. The blizzard still howled, but the immediate danger of the ice and the figure had passed. Still, I couldn't shake the weight in my chest, the sorrow pressing against me. I knew this was only a fraction of the grief that lay trapped under the frozen bay. By the time we reached the cabin, snow had drifted high around the door. I could barely make the latch move with frozen hands, but Collins shoved it open, and we staggered inside. The heater hummed weakly, but it didn't feel warm. My chest still ached, and every corner of the cabin seemed to hold the lingering echo of the singer's grief. I sank into the edge of the bed, shivering, exhausted, my mind unable to process everything I had just seen. Outside, the storm continued its relentless assault, but inside, a different kind of storm had settled. A storm of understanding, of loss, and of the unending presence of those trapped beneath the ice. I finally looked at Collins. His eyes were wide, tired, haunted. "She's not done," he said quietly. "And neither is the bay." I nodded, knowing he was right. Somewhere under the frozen water, countless souls waited. And the singer, the woman I had glimpsed tonight, would keep reaching, keep calling, until someone who could hear, finally answered. For the first time, I understood the full weight of the elder's warning, my father's hidden truth, and the strange, inexplicable pull that had brought me here. Glacier Bay was alive with memory, with grief, with voices that refused to be forgotten. And I had seen them all. The morning after the blizzard, the world felt unreal. Snow lay thick over the shoreline, smooth and unbroken, as if the storm had erased every trace of the chaos from the night before. My boots sank into the drifts, but there were no footprints other than my own. The ice that had groaned and revealed its secrets the night before now looked solid and calm. The frozen bay stretched endlessly, pale and empty. I scanned the horizon with the lingering edge of fear, but the figure was gone. The singer, the woman who had haunted my dreams and my waking hours, had vanished. The wind carried only the faint echo of the storm, nothing else. I felt a strange mixture of relief and loss, as though something had left, but so had a part of me. Collins didn't wait long. By midday, he announced he was leaving. He had had enough of the winter, enough of the uncanny presence that seemed to grow stronger every year. He packed quickly, muttering about paperwork and exhaustion. "I can't stay," he said, eyes flicking toward the bay as if he could still see her through the swirling snow. You take care of yourself." I nodded. There was nothing else to say. I watched him disappear into the drifting white, leaving only the faint sound of snow crunching under his boots. The silence that followed was heavy, pressing against the walls of my cabin in a way I could feel physically. The next day, I filed a report. I wrote everything I could remember. The blizzard, the strange footprints, the humming, the figures on the ice. I documented the frozen bodies I had glimpsed, the skeletal hand beneath the bay, the overwhelming sense of grief that radiated from the shoreline. But when the superintendent read it, he didn't mention the weather or the ice. He looked at the supernatural parts, the singing, the voice in my head, the figure reaching toward me, and gave me a polite, dismissive smile. "Rangers sometimes let the isolation get to them," he said. "Write what you can verify. The rest, just be careful out there." Weeks passed. The bay thawed slowly, the snow melting into slush and water, leaving the shoreline jagged with ice. I avoided it whenever I could. Patrols became mechanical, checking markers, inspecting trails, but I never ventured near the frozen expanse where I had seen her. I couldn't. The memory of that night, the weight of her grief, the silent chorus of those trapped beneath the ice, was too vivid. Still, sometimes in the quiet of the night, I heard the humming again, not in the cabin, not close, but far off, carried on the wind like a memory too persistent to die. It faded quickly, leaving only the empty stillness of Glacier Bay. I lay awake, listening to it, wondering, was it really my grandmother, calling through decades of snow and ice? Or had it been something older, something that used my memories and my bloodline to draw me in? I thought about the countless people who had disappeared here over the years. Rangers, hikers, travelers, families searching for adventure, all swallowed by storms, ice, and silence. Their stories mostly forgotten, reduced to brief mentions in logs, small notes in faded reports, warnings in old ranger journals. And yet, when the wind moaned through the bay, I could almost hear them whispering, humming, reaching. Some nights, I would sit by the window, staring at the pale, shifting horizon, imagining her standing on the ice, waiting. The longing in those eyes, the same eyes I had seen in the storm, felt eternal. I understood now that Glacier Bay didn't forgive. It didn't forget. It held on to what it took. And those who vanished here were never truly gone. They were part of the land, part of the ice, part of the winter itself. I didn't know whether to feel sorrow, fear, or awe, maybe all three. And yet, in the quiet moments, a strange comfort emerged. If the singer, the spirit, the woman, my grandmother, was still out there, maybe she had finally found someone who listened. Maybe that was enough for now. The bay, the ice, and the long, silent nights reminded me of a truth I could not ignore. Some things in Glacier Bay are older than memory, older than any ranger, older than human understanding. The cold can preserve more than bodies. It preserves stories, grief, and longing. And when the wind shifts just right, when the snow drifts against the cabin in a particular way, you can hear them. You can hear them calling. I still patrol the park during the winter, but I do it carefully. I keep my distance from the shoreline where the ice runs thin, where the snow hides the frozen bodies and the memories beneath it. And at night, when I hear the faintest note of a hum drifting through the trees, I do not answer. I only listen for a moment and let it fade, because I have learned something important. Some voices are not meant to be followed. Some hands are not meant to be touched. Some spirits, no matter how familiar, no matter how desperate, are not meant to leave the bay. I've lived through the winter of Glacier Bay, through the storms, the humming, the ice, and the voices that whisper through the snow. I survived because I kept my distance at the right moments, because I respected the cold, the silence, and the grief that waits under the ice. And if you ever find yourself in Glacier Bay in winter, if you feel the wind shift and hear a soft, sorrowful humming carried over the snow and ice, do not answer, not for curiosity, not for bravery, not for memory or loss. Because some calls are not invitations, they are warnings. And some things that wait in the white silence of Glacier Bay never let go.